My name is Mauricio Peña. I'm the editorial director at Borderless magazine. Borderless magazine covers the intersection of labor, advocacy, just the intersection of immigrant-related issues in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. I will be talking about, sorry, I'll go back to the first screen, talking about the migrant shelter in Pilsen, which is the largest city-run shelter in Chicago. We've done two investigations on just the living conditions, the inhumane living conditions that's been described to us by dozens of migrants at this point, and also videos and photos that we've reviewed, as well as various documents, emails, grievance reports, and incident reports. And so just a little bit of background. Since August 2022, Chicago has opened nearly 30 migrant shelters to accommodate the influx of new arrivals being sent by bus and plane from Texas. For months, thousands of migrants camped out at police stations as officials worked to open shelters across the city. And forgive me, I haven't looked at the latest data. So far, more than 35,600 migrants have arrived, and about 12,000 at this point reside at shelters as of mid-February, according to city data. And in this time, Chicago has really struggled to find housing for the waves of migrants that are coming in. City officials have outsourced its shelter system to a staffing company that has failed to provide living conditions that meet the United Nations refugee standards at some of these shelter sites, including the city's largest shelter in Pilsen. To date, Favorite Healthcare Staffing has paid over $100 million since August 2022, according to city records. That number needs to be updated, but it far exceeds 100 million at this point. And so plans for the Pilsen migrant shelter. Last fall, city officials announced the plans for the shelter on Chicago's Lower West Side that would house up to 100 new arrivals. And this shelter specifically is focused for families with children. The building is a former manufacturing complex inside one of the city's industrial corridor. It's actually part of a planned manufacturing district, which, if you're not aware, specifically focused for industry and prohibits any residential use. And so in the first investigation, as we were talking to dozens of migrants that lived in the shelter, we checked city records, and it showed that this taller building on I think it's a 5-story building, failed an annual inspection by the Department of Buildings. The owners failed to maintain elevator equipment in safe and sound working conditions. And it's unclear when the building owner made any corrections or when a new city inspection was conducted at the site. The 2021 inspection is the last on record. And so the adjoining building, the one-story warehouse, at least in the Department of Buildings records, has not inspected that building since 2016. And so this is a quote from one of the migrants that we spoke with. All my kids had infections because of this ceiling is shedding fibers. So as it's been described to us by many migrants, dozens of migrants at this point, the ceiling from this warehouse has been shedding dust and fibers for months. And life inside the shelter. In early December, more than 2,300 migrants were living at the shelter, initially intended for 1,000 people. But again, I just want to underscore that this is a photo from inside that one of the migrants provided to me. This building is not intended for residential use. And so in our reporting, Borderless reviewed several videos and photos and spoke with more than a dozen migrants who described inhumane conditions, and that included cramped living quarters, ration water, mistreatment from workers, freezing temperatures, unsanitary bathrooms, and spoiled or raw food. At this time, they also described outbreaks of various illnesses, including chickenpox, the flu, and upper respiratory infections spreading without sufficient medical attention. They treat us terribly, like dogs. Another quote from another migrant that lives in the shelter. And in our first and second investigation, all of the migrants asked us not to use their name and to remain anonymous out of fear of retaliation or fear that it might impact their pending immigration cases. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the insufficient medical attention, because if you aren't aware, the shelter has at this point last I checked this morning was, I believe, 5 cases of the measles inside the shelter, and that number has gone up, or at least I've seen, some tweets from reporters noting that it's up, but I haven't been able to, I haven't checked the latest numbers. So amid an outbreak of illnesses, migrants described one weekly visit from healthcare professionals that lasted a few hours to see more than 2,300 individuals. Most families who spoke with Borderless said the visits were quick and no treatment was provided. This woman who was describing the situation. There's no medicine, one woman told Borderless. For those who aren't working, we are on the street asking for help to buy medicine. At the moment, my husband is sick. He has a throat infection and the flu. They checked him out, but they didn't give him anything. No antibiotics, no pain reliever. So at this time, there was, many warning signs. City officials, including the mayor, were warned about unsanitary and safe living conditions. Just weeks after opening so the shelter was open in early October, and by the end of October, Mayor Brandon Johnson and other top city officials were alerted to these safety concerns, which included migrants sleeping over uncovered sewage drains, other issues including the unsanitary bathrooms, the spoiled food, cramped conditions, and the illnesses that were running rampant or spreading rapidly inside the shelter, this crowded shelter. And so in our latest investigation that we reported or published a couple of weeks ago, in the month of November alone, at least 16 migrants were transferred to hospitals with severe medical conditions. These included a 4-year-old who experienced chest pain, a fever and body aches, a resident who had facial droop, and a resident with a fever who couldn't feel their hands and feet. At the same time, migrants submitted at least 17 anonymous grievance reports about the Halsey shelter between October 8th and December 31st. And if you're not aware, there was a 5-year-old boy, John Carlos Martinez Rivero, who died. So on December 17th, the day that he died, a parent with a child who had a fever of 103 degrees Fahrenheit complained that a shelter staff member had canceled their call to an ambulance because he didn't see the kid being sick. This is one of the grievance reports that we received through a FOIA request. They keep us as prisoners. A migrant wrote in Spanish, "We can't say anything to them because they reprimand us. And yesterday, a child died due to negligence." So this is John Carlos. So 3 days after we published our first investigation, the 5-year-old died after being sick for days. Parents of the child expressed concerns to staff after the child's lips were blue. Instead of taking it seriously, staff attributed the symptoms to cold weather. The medical examiner's office said that John ultimately I believe it was in early February, the medical examiner's office released its report and said that he died of sepsis from multiple infections, including strep, COVID-19, and the common cold. And throughout, we've been following for months since that initial report that we published, the initial investigation we published in December. Just keeping tabs on this migrant shelter, just because of all the things that we've heard, all the things that we continue to hear. But this volunteer, she's a social worker and volunteer that's been supporting migrants at shelters and at previously when many of them were staying at police stations. This was a preventable death, and it was 100% expected. We knew this was coming. We've been raising the alarms for months and months and months. And as I mentioned previously, some of these emails were sent to Alderman Lee, who is in nearby Chinatown. This, as I mentioned, this is in Pilsen, but she raised the concerns about the shelter with Brandon Johnson, with other top city officials and health commissioners, just to get some answers about all of these concerns that continued to happen until sorry, until this boy's death. And so the city has defended its actions and announced an investigation into the death, but little has changed inside the shelter, according to migrants. Dozens have described increased threats from staff, lights being turned off during medical emergencies, and some have been kicked out for sharing videos of the shelter with broadcast journalists that have aired some of that footage. And this is something that another migrant told me. There's a lot of illnesses here, and they're trying to hide it. Yeah, and so a couple of weeks ago, we published this new investigation that I mentioned, and the several almost 10 migrants that we spoke with described that there were slight improvements to food and fixed heating conditions inside the shelter. One migrant who left in the shelter in December said that she saw changes come quickly after Giancarlos's death. She said more doctors would come to the shelter, the food improved, the playground was built for children. And if a child was sick, migrants were provided thermometers to check their temperatures. But the vast majority of the other migrants that spoke with us said that the mistreatment, it still continues. My shelter staff frequently threatens to kick people out for taking videos or photos. They also said that bathrooms remained unsanitary. One man that I spoke with said that to use the bathroom, they have to ask for toilet paper. So no toilet paper is left there. He said, sigue igual. The man said in Spanish, it's still the same. And so I'll just backtrack a little bit. Just some updates as of Friday, as I mentioned earlier, there's been several cases of measles. One thing that the city has said pretty early on after the death of Giancarlos is that they provide comprehensive medical care and vaccinations as migrants are processed. So at the landing site and when they get to shelters, we've heard that hasn't been the case. And in recent days, they've partnered with the county and federally qualified health providers to expand that coverage and offer vaccinations specifically for measles. And so that runs contrary to the framing and the narrative that the city has given for months, that they've already been providing this care, but in recent days, they've vaccinated over 900 migrants at this Pilsen shelter for measles. And also, and just to put into context, the last available census of the migrant shelter is that it remains around 2,000 migrants, according to the city dashboard of the Pilsen site. There's still, I was getting messages before coming into this a call from some of the migrants that I remain in contact about just the lack of details that they've been provided in this current outbreak. The quarantine policies, there's just very few. They initially gave, they woke them up at 1 o'clock in the morning on Friday morning to let them know that there was a cases of the measles. They were in lockdown. And then, for hours, they didn't know what was going on until health officials were there to start vaccinating and providing information about the vaccination and assessing who was and wasn't vaccinated. And there's a lot of fear and confusion because sometimes there's, with the few details that they're receiving from the city and shelter staff, there is just a lot of people who are rumors that start filtering through the entire 2,000 people that are there. And so, yeah, we continue to monitor it. We have some other investigations in the work into the Pilsen shelter, but also the larger city-run shelter system and the things that are going on at various other sites in Chicago. And this is our newsletter. Would welcome you guys to sign up for Borderless Magazine newsletter. As I mentioned before, we cover quite a bit of information, not just the migrant situation, but our various immigrant communities in Chicago and some in the nearby suburbs, and hoping to expand beyond that in the next couple of months. And so I might have gone a little bit too fast, but I'm happy to take questions now that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Mauricio. Yeah, very interesting and sobering presentation. So thank you so much for kind of telling us what's happened and some recent updates as well that I know a lot of people were probably very interested in hearing as well. So yeah, for those in the audience, do please make sure to put in any questions that you do have in the chat feature so we can ask them here. But yeah, I guess just to kind of really start, um, can you just say a little bit more of like how this particular site in Pilsen kind of got selected by the city and like why, kind of what their justification for actually choosing this site was?
So that's an avenue of reporting that I am exploring now. I think so I can't answer that question at the moment. But I think a lot of just internal, like anecdotally, what we've been hearing is they were searching for large footprint to be able to support some of the waves of migrants that were coming in. Around that time, the large tent facility was being planned for Brighton Park. So it was a large migrant shelter that would have housed, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 at the time. And I'm trying to just get my facts right, but at the time, the state essentially backed out and said that they wouldn't support the tent plant in Brighton Park, in part because of the environmental health concerns. So there was some testing that was done that showed there was some contamination, and the state had fears of what that might mean to put families on contaminated, build a tent and house migrant families on contaminated soil. And all that to say is, that happened around the same time. So I'm not exactly sure why this specific site was chosen, especially given the history of the site, especially given the fact that it's on an industrial corridor. It's in a planned manufacturing district, which doesn't allow for residential use, and hasn't been inspected for a couple of years or failed recent inspections. And so there's a lot of questions as to why the city planned on opening on a site that was never meant for habitation.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for noting that. Yeah, because it seems odd and it seems like it would be kind of similar environmental concerns, like a previous manufacturing site to the park that they were looking at. So it does seem maybe a little odd. Right, Noah, do you want to take the
Sure,
next
yeah.
question?
So another question was, has there been any kind of federal response to the inadequate migrant housing here?
No, the city, Brandon Johnson and other mayors of cities that have been receiving migrants have advocated to the federal government for more funding to continue housing migrants. Um, and so we haven't seen any indication that the federal government plans to fund or provide more funding for it. On the state side, I know that they've been running asylum seeker emergency rental assistance program, but that money is also coming from the federal government and will likely run out soon as well.
Got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, another question here from the audience. So suppose you have a population of about 30,000 migrants, similar to those in Chicago. What would you expect to see in terms of housing in a typical liberal democracy? What is a realistic benchmark?
Um, I don't know if I can speak for like what I would like to see. But I mean, I think something that we are seeing is that Chicago struggles are not unique. New York has struggled with its migrant shelters. Denver has struggled with its migrant shelters. Um, I think that Los Angeles has been okay, but largely because there hasn't been the influx that other cities have seen. To that question about like the influx of 30,000 migrants and what you would like to see, I just want to like point out that prior to the, you know, Venezuelans and Colombians and other migrants that were coming from Central America, we absorbed about 30,000 Ukrainian refugees. And there was, not the struggle that we're seeing with the Venezuelan migrants. And so, I know that there was a war happening in Ukraine, but at the same time, we're not seeing the same struggles that we saw absorbing the Ukrainian refugees as we're seeing with the Venezuelan migrants. So I just want to point that out.
Yeah, I guess following up on that, we have another audience question. Is it appropriate to use the standard building inspection regulations for single family construction when looking at migrant housing?
I mean, I think there should be a standard that the city holds to ensure that the safety of especially vulnerable populations. Um, there should be a standard where there's inspection, there's oversight, there's um, just some universal standard so that you're ensuring that people aren't living in an industrial warehouse that has not been inspected, that is not suitable. One thing that I forgot to mention um, in the presentation is that um, it's not clear to me who was doing the construction, but there was construction being done um, at this Pilsen migrant shelter while residents were living uh, and present in the shelter. And so dust was raining down on them seen videos where you can hear just the machinery going on. Another video of workers doing some work while children play next to this worker. And so I think there needs to be some sort of standard to hold someone accountable for how these shelters are being run. I don't think that we can just stick people in a box in a large warehouse and ignore them or ignore the warning signs, because then we have the negligence that, you know, very may have well led to the death of a 5-year-old boy. And now an outbreak of measles because you stuffed over 2,000 people in something that you said you'd only put 400 to 1,000 people in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so another question from the audience, I guess, kind of on that note, but kind of thinking more broadly beyond, this particular site and, just kind of migrant housing in general. The question is, has the city made any headway with the state on a unified shelter system for all unhoused peoples, no matter their relationship, I'm assuming like migrant status, within the US?
I think the one thing that we've noticed about this situation is that there already is the city has a shelter system, but they've been creating a separate shelter system for specifically for migrants, and so they are essentially building new systems when they already have some in place. That said, I know that there's before the migrant crisis, we already faced a shortage in housing, a shortage in affordable housing, a shortage in shelter space in Chicago, and just, I mean, frankly, across the nation. I haven't seen any coordination between the state and the city in terms of how they plan to streamline some of these, regardless of whether this is a migrant crisis or people who are, citizens who are unhoused. And so that's some reporting that I haven't done yet. That's some reporting that I haven't seen recently from other news outlets, but that's definitely an avenue of interest for all of us, just to see what kind of work is being done in that space and coordination between the city and state to ensure that people are receiving adequate housing or are building the infrastructure and the scaffolding to allow for a more sustainable shelter system and a more streamlined system that supports vulnerable populations.
Got it. We've got a comment in the chat that just says, thank you for your reporting, Mauricio. I appreciate all the work you've put in on these investigations. And I completely agree. Another question I had was, is there any kind of timeline established surrounding the legal process of these migrants' immigration status? How long they're going to be confined without being able to legally work?
Yeah, so that's another avenue of reporting that Borderless has been looking into. Katrina Pham, who worked on this investigation, did a story on just the federal backlogs in work permits. So I'm blinking on the time frame, but the federal government expanded work permits for migrants from Venezuela that arrived before July 31st, 2023. But even in those applications, the fees are somewhat high. And for many migrants who are coming here with nothing, it's difficult to scrap that money, especially when, I mean, it's a chicken and the egg kind of situation. You're not able to work, so you can't raise the money for these temporary protected status applications, which allow for you to work legally in the US. And so we've done some reporting around that and how there is a backlog, and sometimes it can take over a year for those to be processed through the federal government. And also there's a backlog in asylum applications, which also costs money. And so there's a lot of, I think, bottleneck that's happening there, which is preventing them from getting out of the shelter, getting a job and getting out of the shelter system. There are some migrants who are working under the table and are facing threats and harassment and abuse and wage theft. And so they're being taken advantage of. And so I think there's just a lot of miscommunication that's happening on every level of government. But ultimately, the federal government handles these work permits and these applications. And so it's the onus is on them in terms of like processing and making sure that these applications are done in a fast manner, especially given, the current situation.
Great. Yeah, thank you for noting all that. I guess one of the questions I had and was curious about too, like I know you were primarily, focused on this one shelter in Chicago. I was curious just like how much you see this as like these issues kind of being systemic across all the shelters in Chicago, or maybe even across the US. Have you, in your reporting, kind of come across or seen any shelters that are actually functioning well in your eyes? And if there are any, like what kind of makes them different, do you think?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've been trying to look into is like who's doing a good job, who's doing well. At least anecdotally, what we've seen, I mentioned earlier, New York is struggling, Denver struggled, Chicago is struggling with how city-run shelters are functioning. And I think a big part of the problem is a lot of the work is being contracted out to staffing companies. And so, there's a lack of transparency sometimes on how, these companies are functioning and providing or not providing some of the services that they're supposed to be providing. And so I know that a lot of our focus has been at this Pilsen shelter in part because of the tip that we received back in December about the conditions there. But since then, we've heard from other folks and other sites and some reporting that we haven't been able to publish yet, or we're still working on, that some sites are very similar to the Pilsen site, even though they have a smaller population. So I think I would assume that one with a smaller population might be able to better serve the community, but even we're seeing and we're hearing from city officials that there's so many needs and diverse needs, and not enough staff to really provide for those needs. And so I don't think I can say like with definitively that like what the issue is just like across the shelter system. But we're hearing the same thing for many of the shelters that we've been reporting on.
Got it. Yeah. We have a question from the audience. What kind of educational opportunities are available for both children and adults in the current migrant system?
So the children are eligible to go to Chicago public schools, and I think I don't have um, I don't have numbers on how many migrant children are going to the schools, but I know I think in the thousands there are a couple thousand that are in the Chicago public school system. I've heard a variety of things in terms of some community-based organizations who are at these allowed to work in these shelters are providing some forms of education and workshops, while at other sites, these community-based organizations aren't being allowed, to do some of this more extensive work like English language classes or other types of resources. And so it's been an opaque situation trying to discern what exactly is being offered from shelter to shelter. But I mean, I can say that the migrant children are, many of them, thousands of them are going to Chicago public schools. I can't say what type of resources, educational resources are being provided to their parents.
Yeah, another question we had was kind of at the very beginning of your talk, you had talked about the UN statutes around refugee housing and how, that particular site you were looking at didn't even meet kind of those statutes. Based on that, is there any kind of recourse to be found in those UN statutes that you had mentioned around refugee housing and not meeting those?
I haven't looked at what the recourse was for not meeting those. But I can check right now to see if I can come up with a quick filter.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
No, it's all right. But yeah, some of the standards were um, heating and sanitary bathrooms and things like that. And as we've seen and as we've heard and as we continue to hear, a lot of those infrastructures just wasn't there to provide, I think, the volume of migrants that were funneled into this migrant shelter. And so in terms of the recourse, I would have to maybe get back to you on that one.
Got it. Thank you, Mauricio. We have one more question. Thanks so much for your time. This is if folks want to help out the migrant population in Chicago, do you have a recommendation for ways that people can help out?
We have a resource guide that on how let me see if I can. I don't know if it looks like I'm still sharing screen. I can look it up real quick, but we have a resource guide on the website that shows different ways you can donate or let me 1 second and I can send that your way. Borderless. So I'm going to show this on the screen.
I was going to say, if you want to drop the link in the chat too, I can see about putting it in the live stream so folks can also click on it more easily.
Yeah, but this is basically it. I'm going to drop the link now. It just has different organizations across the city, downtown, north side, west side, south side, far south side, and other organizations that you can contact to make donations. Yeah. Yeah, happy to answer any more questions you have before time runs up.
All right, thank you so much. I think that might actually be all the questions that we do have at this point. But yeah, if you do want to drop the link in the chat there too, so I can see about dropping in or it looks like maybe somebody already has. Looks like Sean might have beat us to it. Thanks, Sean. But we can also post it on our Slack as well, so make sure that folks have it, can access it easily if need be. But yeah, thank you again so much for joining us this evening, Mauricio. It was very enlightening and really appreciate your time this evening. So thank you. And with that, just a reminder that we will be moving now to our post-presentation Zoom call. And the link should be hopefully showing up on the screen soon here. And similarly, we'll try to drop the link to that in the chat as well, so people can head over to that Zoom call in just a minute. And with that, Noah and I are contractually obligated by Chi Hack Night to say our usual farewell on the count of three. 1, 2, 3, go forth
Go forth
and
and hack.